I am a licensed independent clinical social worker. I have about 20 years of experience working in a school setting, first starting off in Head Start and working with preschool kids, and then as a school social worker, and then as a central office administrator, I served as the director of student services, overseeing the mental health and behavioral health services in our district. And I'm now doing some things with grant writing and funds and funding, things I never thought I would be doing as a social worker, but it's been really interesting to be able to be involved in that side of things as well. I also have a small business, which is what's bringing you here today, called Resilience Impact. And we do training and conferences around social emotional learning, mental health practices, educator resilience, and trauma-informed practices in schools. And so thank you for being here today. We do these monthly trainings. We do these trainings monthly. I guess that's a little redundant. Yes. So be on the lookout for another one coming up in March. I think we're going to do something around alternatives to suspension. I'm licensed as a special education director and superintendent. I'm also an associate professor in our graduate social work department here locally at Winona State University. I'm mom of 4 and I love old houses. We have a thing of buying old houses and redoing them. And I just love the history and character that they bring. So our plan today is we're going to talk just briefly around suicidality and some of the increases in suicidality over the last 3 years. We're going to do an overview of the screener tool that we're teaching on today. We're going to practice with the tool. We're going to talk about some of the sticky situations that come up with assessing suicidality in school. And then we're going to practice a little bit and finish up. So that is our plan. I think we'll be under an hour today as we go through. If you have to leave or if you miss something, I am sending out the recording to everyone. And I do think we have a full room. So there are likely people that aren't able to get in, but if one of them is your coworker, make sure that they know we'll be sending out the recording later. I'll try to get it out today. So anytime we're talking about suicidality, I want to just mention that and give permission that sometimes this can be triggering, right? And you have permission to take care of yourself. Whatever you need to do, this information is going to be here. You can come back to it. Sometimes I think this information can be triggering. This is a really important topic to me because as a young person, I struggled with suicidality for 2 to 3 years. And so I struggled with suicidality for several years and actually had a plan, had a kind of a date of when I felt like I could endure through. And it was through that experience that this topic became so passionate to me, because I don't think people knew quite how to respond to me. And I don't think people knew how I was suffering. And not once during that time period did anybody ask me if I was considering suicide, including therapists that I was seeing. And so for me, one of my goals is to increase our fluency with talking about suicide. It's a hard topic to talk about, and yet I think it's a really important one. And I want to make sure that we have the language and that we have the practice and the tools that we need in order to be able to bring suicide and suicidality out of the dark and into the light and have conversations about it. So our learning objectives are to talk about how student symptomology has changed over time, practice using the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale to assess suicidality, learning strategies for responding to suicidal ideation based on that assessment data, and collectively thinking through how do we respond to some sticky situations. So this is the kind of statistic that we hear that's been out there for a long time, just on a general, that 1 in 5 children will have a mental illness before the age of 18. I think some of the statistics that are coming out now might show that that's even higher as we consider like this post-pandemic or wherever we are in relation to the pandemic, that we're seeing an increase compared to pre-pandemic. We also know that our mental health happens on a continuum, right? It's not that this person's mentally ill and this person is mentally well and there's no in between. We know that people are on this continuum of being able to have different levels of mental health. And I know that you probably see that in yourself, you see that in your students, and we know that things are labeled a mental illness when they get to the point where they are disrupting our functioning. And we want to help students move towards this mental wellness. In the same way, suicidality also occurs on a continuum. And I think we tend to think about suicidality as either they're suicidal or they're not. But we know that some students, in fact, maybe most people have at some point in their life had kind of passive suicidal thoughts. Like, what would it be like just to not have to do this anymore? What if I could just go to sleep tonight and not wake up? And so there's kind of these thoughts that come into your head. They're passive, there's no plan, you're not actually going to do it, but there's these thoughts of like, I just don't want to do it anymore. And we know that that's kind of at one end. And at the other end, we have students and adults that we might be working with that have a plan, they have a date, they know how they're going to do it. They've taken steps to prepare for that. And often our students are somewhere in the middle where they maybe have an idea about a plan. They don't think they're going to do it, but maybe someday in the future they might. So we know that suicidality is not this kind of like check the box kind of thing. It happens on a continuum. And that's one important piece that we want to be able to capture in our assessment, is that often kids will struggle with suicide over a period of time. It's not that, oh, they made a statement, they're coming into your office, you're assessing for suicide. We admit them to the hospital and then somehow they are not suicidal anymore, having suicidal ideation. And the reality is a lot of kids, even if it results in a hospitalization, even if if the whole system works, they likely will still be struggling with some suicidal ideation once they return to your building. So thinking about how do we assess over time, how do we kind of know what that student's baseline is and when things are getting worse or when things are getting better, when they're moving along this continuum. This is data from Minnesota. Just a second, I need to blow my nose quick. Thank you. This is data from Minnesota, but we do a survey, and I think many states do something similar, that's put out by our public health department at a statewide level, and looks at so many different topics of health, but one area where they look at is mental health. And I thought this was really interesting data. So we have from 2016, this is how our students responded. In 2022, over on the right, this is how our students responded. So I think it's always interesting to look at how things have changed. So over on the left, you'll see the question that the students asked. Over the last 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by or little interest and pleasure in doing other things? So that's what we call anhedonia, which is a symptom of depression. And then you'll see the last question is how often have you felt bothered by feeling down, depressed, or hopeless? And so you can see, I think one area where we are seeing an increase in the data that I've looked at is with 11th grade females. So if we look at more than half the days and nearly every day, and we add those together in 2016, you'll see 14% plus 9%. So we were at 23% were indicating that they were experiencing some anhedonia. If we go and look at what they were in 22, we can see that that's up to 31%. Pretty big jump. We also asked 5th graders something similar, but in more developmentally appropriate language. And it says, I worry a lot. And you can see that in those 5th grade girls who put agree or strongly agree, we were at 39%, which is pretty high back in 2016. But now you can see that it's 29 and 23%. So let me do math, 40, 52%. So again, a pretty big increase. So if you're feeling busier in your role about at schools, this is likely why our kids are reporting that they're feeling symptoms that are related to mood disorder diagnosis at a higher level than they were, what would that have been, 6 years ago? So quickly, just some warning signs around suicide is, I'll let you read these, but one thing that I think sometimes is missed in kids, and you probably know this, but often depression-like symptoms show up more as aggression and irritability than the kind of typical picture we get with depression, which is maybe lying on the couch or not able to do anything or crying or sad all the time. Kids earlier in development will often look more like irritability when it is they're struggling with these mental illness symptoms. So we're looking overall just in a change from baseline. How was the student doing before? And sometimes we don't have the privilege of knowing the before. We get kids in our doors and we don't necessarily have that background, but looking for what is that change? How are they talking about themselves? How are they talking about death? What kinds of behaviors are they engaging in? Do they talk about a feeling of hopelessness or being a burden? Are they isolating or feeling alone? Those are all signs that might be something's going on and they're having some of that suicidal ideation. And it's worth checking into and talking with kids about. We also know that some things put kids more at risk of suicide. If there's a history of substance abuse, they're in chronic pain. Relationships problems is a really big one for our students. It feels like the end of the world, whether they lost their best friend, there was a romantic relationship that ended. Those can often lead in overwhelming feelings where kids just feel like they can't go on anymore. So what to do if you're concerned? And again, this is from our suicide prevention training. Many of you probably know this, but we always want to establish rapport with the student. We want them to know that we care about them, that they're not in trouble, and we just want to check in on them. It is also really important that we directly ask the question, are you thinking about suicide? Are you having thoughts of suicide? Have you thought about killing yourself? And that's a hard question to ask. I've asked it so many times, and sometimes my heart still goes a little bit flutter because I think we're just wired to not talk about death in that way, or maybe it's cultural, I'm not sure, but I understand that it's a hard question sometimes to get out. And I think it's really important to be able to ask that directly. If they're saying yes, or if you're worried about them, clearly we're not leaving them alone, and we want to get them to the contact in their building that can assess for suicide, which is likely all of you as you're here today, and make sure that we do a good assessment to help ensure safety for that student. So the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale is a tool that has been used extensively across clinical, medical, and research settings. And so we're going to watch a short video here about that explains that. It's been translated in 103 languages. It can be used across the lifespan from, I think the tool says 5. So at younger ages, if you're assessing some suicidality, you're going to have to probably use your best judgment in whether these questions make sense for that student's developmental level, but all the way up to however old that an individual that you might be interacting with. So the same tool could be used if you have a grandparent in that you're worried about and you need to assess for suicidality. It is available in 3 formats. Oh, Shireen, see your comment here about that you can't see what I am sharing. Can other people see what I'm sharing? I sure hope so. Okay, good. Okay. Yes, I will be sending out the slides and the recording. I will get those to you. Thanks for assuring me that you are seeing this. The tool is available in 3 formats: the lifetime recent clinical version, the screener version, and the pediatric version. Today, we are talking about the screener version. I think it gives us enough data for what we need at schools. In my community specifically, it is also the tool that they're using in our emergency department. That's the tool that they're using in our mobile crisis response. And so I also really like this tool for that reason. It's that it gives us a common language. If a student is going to the emergency department, we can kind of send those results or get those results to them, and they'll understand that tool just by looking at it quickly. I also think it gives us, as school professionals, sometimes I feel like there can be a lack of credibility perceived by other people. And so I think being able to have a tool along with the narrative is helpful, again, if we're doing some referral for some care follow-up after we do our assessment. Okay, we're going to watch this video. It's short. This is Dr. Kelly Posner, who was the developer of this tool, just kind of giving an overview of it. You are seeing the right screen right now, right? With the video. And I'm going to look in the chat. Great. Okay, here we go.
If they had a behavior, it was predictive, and if they had both, it was 2 times as predictive.
Mm-hmm.
Suicide is a major public health crisis. It's a leading cause of death across the world, across ages. It's an incredibly prevalent and devastating public health issue. And there's no way for us to prevent if we can't identify. We know that 50% of people who die by suicide see their primary care doctor the month before they die. We should be asking these questions the way we monitor for blood pressure. The Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale was developed in the context of a national trial to meet this great need in the field that hadn't been met before in terms of how to best identify people at risk.
For the first time, and as long as anyone can remember, we may be actually able to make a dent in the rates of suicide that have existed in our population and have remained constant over time. And that would be an enormous achievement in terms of public health care and preventing loss of life.
Used to be, in the past, somebody would only get asked about a suicide attempt. And then if you just ask about that, you miss the person that bought the gun yesterday or put the noose around their neck and changed their mind. These are things that we cannot afford to miss. So covering the full spectrum was of critical importance. When people give you certain answers about what they've been thinking, like they might intend to act on their thoughts or they have a specific plan and some intent, we know that that actually can predict at this point who is going to go ahead and try to end their lives.
The benefit of this is that in emergency rooms, in clinical settings, in schools, in primary care offices, this can be used by doctors and medical professionals or people who are trained in it who don't have any medical training at all previously but are trained in the use of the instrument. This can be used to screen individuals, and then if they reach this threshold level of concern, to refer them for further evaluation and possible intervention.
So at the end of the day, it's about saving lives and better directing limited resources to the people who actually need them.
So this is what the scale looks like. Again, you had it in your chat there if you want to pull this up and follow along. It's short. It's only 6 questions. And you will see that the parts that are bolded and underlined are text that is meant to be asked directly to the person that you're working with. So you'll see that there are questions that talk about suicidal intent, and suicidal behavior. So when we're doing an assessment, we want to think about both. Is there an intent to commit suicide? An intent means anytime that somebody wants to end their life. And then suicidal behavior is the next set of questions. So you'll see that questions 1 and 2 talk about suicidal intent. If you get a positive response there, you follow up with 3, 4, and 5. Question 6 is about suicidal behavior. So questions 1 and 2, have you ever wished you were dead or wished you could go into sleep and not wake up? This question is kind of an easier entry point into the discussion. And you're able to draw out a level of suicidality that is maybe more passive, maybe is people that don't have a plan, but they do have some intent or wish that they could just die or not go on or fall asleep. And so if you get that, that's an easier question to sometimes ask, and you may often get a yes to that question, but when you get to question number 2, get a no. So either one is indicating that there's some intent, but it's 2 different ways of asking the same question and kind of have different levels of maybe severity in them. If you get, sorry, I can't say, if you get a yes to either of these questions, then you go on and you ask question number 3 and 5. If you get a no, if you say, have you ever wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? And they say no. Have you ever had thoughts of actually killing yourself? And they say no. Then you go on to question number 6. If you get a yes to either of these, regardless of when it happened or what the timing, even if sometimes you might get like, yes, but that was 10 years ago. We still want to collect that data, especially if this is the first time that we're doing a suicide assessment. Then we talk about prepare, these are the ones around suicidal behavior. Have you ever done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to do anything to end your life? So just like Dr. Posner said in the video, we want to make sure we don't miss the person who maybe bought the gun or has pills that they have under their bed where they haven't actually engaged in behavior, but they've started to do it and they prepared. And if yes, was this in the last 3 months? One thing to know in terms of the suicide intent here is that a suicide attempt for purposes of the Columbia is anytime a person took action and with the intent of killing themselves. It's more about what the person thought than whether or not the actual lethality of the method that they had tried. So for example, I had a middle school student that I worked with who was suicidal, and her kind of method that she was going to kill herself by was starvation. She was planning on not eating food. She was not eating food. I mean, I think at this point it was only like 12 hours she hadn't ate. And she was intent. She thought that was going to kill her. So that would be considered an attempt, even though we as adults know that that's a very difficult and not very lethal way to kill yourself. But for her, that was action she was taking with the intent of killing herself. So for the purposes of the Columbia, that would be considered a suicide attempt. So there's a couple of examples in here that I want to go through. And these are directly from the Columbia training materials. So this first one, the student wants to get out of the house and away from her abusive mother. The student takes 6 ibuprofen after researching a lethal dose. She is transported to the emergency department and her stomach is pumped. She is admitted to the hospital. So if you can put in the chat, would that be a suicide attempt or not? So yes or no, is this a suicide attempt? Okay. So it's interesting, we're seeing lots of yeses, but the answer is actually no, this isn't a suicide attempt. And here's why. The reason that she did it was to get out of the house and away from her mother. Nowhere in here does it say there was an intent to die. She researched a lethal dose, but 6 ibuprofen is not a lethal dose. So this was not an attempt, because the purpose of this action was to get out away from her mother and to get to a place of safety. So while it looks like a suicide attempt, right, it has all the markers of she took some pills, she went to the hospital, her stomach was pumped, she's admitted to the hospital. It looks like an attempt. From the student's perspective, that was not her motivation in engaging in that behavior. It was about getting out of her mother's house. Next one, suicide attempt or not. A young woman after a fight with her boyfriend feels like she wants to die. She grabs a knife and creates a scratch, and then she changes her mind. How about that one? Do you think that's a suicide attempt or not? And thank you all for answering. No, no. Okay, we're getting lots of no's, some yeses. Okay, well, thank you. This one seems evenly split in the chat. So again, we're looking at, did the individual engage in the behavior with the intent to die? So again, even though she only scratched herself, because she did it with the intent that she wanted to die, it would be considered an attempt. So again, it goes to why it's so important to ask questions about, like, why did you do that? Or what were you thinking when you did that? Instead of just looking at the action. So this would be considered a suicide attempt. Okay, we have one more of these. Child was feeling ignored. She went into the kitchen where her mother and sister were talking. She takes a knife and cuts her wrists. She denies wanting to die, but wants attention. Suicide attempt or not? Okay, we're getting it, right? No, it's not an attempt, right? Because the child is saying, I didn't do it because I wanted to die. I did it because I wanted my mom and my sister to pay attention to me. So it's so important to not only look at that behavior, but to be able to ask the questions and be able to assess what the individual is thinking and the purpose in their mind behind that behavior. How about a high school? I guess we have 4 of them. Sorry, I thought there was only 3. High school student cuts their wrist after a fight with their boyfriend. Is that a suicide attempt or not? Okay, based on what we know, no. But right, there's a key piece of information missing in this one, is why did you cut your wrist? It could have been, but we don't know why she cut her wrist. So that would be the important question that we would need to know in order to be able to make that determination. Right now, based on what we know, well, we're not sure. We need more information. Okay, so to score the screener. So when you're using the screener with a student, you want it to be a conversation. If you do this regularly, which I'm sure that many of you are engaged in these conversations on a daily basis probably, is that you don't necessarily need this paper in front of you once you learn these questions. However, at the beginning, you can sometimes ask directly from the questions. You can sometimes weave this into a conversation and then score it. But the first question of, have you wished you were dead or wish you could go to sleep and not wake up? So if there's a yes, right, it puts you in this kind of light yellow range here. So the light yellow range on this, what is this called? On this slide is considered low risk. So if they indicate yes to either question 1 or 2, but then indicate no all the way through, they would be at low risk. We're still concerned about them. There is still some risk and we want to follow up, but that would put them in the low risk range. If we get a yes on 1 and 2, we're going to ask 3, 4, and 5. Have you been thinking how you might do this? So if they've been having some thoughts, they, I've been doing a little research. I think a lot of kids turn to the internet to think about this. And so sometimes asking specifically, have you searched anything around this, is sometimes a good question to ask. But if you get a yes there, that automatically puts them into that moderate risk category. Question 4, have you had these thoughts and have intention of acting on them? So again, sometimes you'll get like, no, I would never do this. So that would be a no. Sometimes you might get kids who are who say yes, or yeah, I think I might. And then question 4, have you started to work out or worked out the details of how to kill yourself? Do you intend to carry out this plan? Again, those 2 questions, if you get an affirmative answer to those, would put them in that high risk category. Then you get to number 6, which is asking about suicidal behaviors. So have you ever done anything, started to do anything, or prepared to end your life? And there's a bunch of examples there: collected pills, obtained a gun, gave away valuables, wrote a suicide note, took out the pills and lined them up on your desk, but you didn't actually take them, or you have the pills and you have them hidden under your mattress. Lots of different types of behavior. So sometimes, using some of those examples for just some probing questions based on what you learned in 3, 4, and 5. If it's a yes, asking if it's in the past 3 months. So clearly more recent preparations would indicate a higher level of risk than something that happened 10 years ago. And being able to document that is really helpful when you follow up with that student in 2 weeks and you ask some of these same questions, because kids that are in that low risk category they're not going to be admitted into the hospital. They're going to be in school every day, or they're going to be at school. I don't know if they'll be there every day. And we want to be able to follow up with them. And so I think that is just one thing that has changed, I think, a little bit since I started in schools thinking about suicidality. Is we used to think about like, oh, they are suicidal, right? It was like a yes or no. And if it was a yes, it was the idea of like, okay, well, that's not the school's role, and we're going to kind of send them somewhere, or somebody else is going to deal with that. And I've talked with a lot of providers and maybe principals who are frustrated, like, this kid's suicidal, we sent him to the ED and now they're just back. And that is the reality, because we have a lot of kids who have this chronic suicidal ideation. And what we want to be able to assess for is when there's a change. So being able to use this tool, kids are going to get in the routine with you too of answering these questions. I think it becomes easier to talk about, and there is protection in having open conversations about suicidal ideation. That in itself is protecting them. And so being able to use this as a guide of like, okay, what's changed? And if we see, they were at low risk, now they're at moderate risk, that's an important follow-up point, right? That's important that what's going on, and how do we keep from getting in the high risk category or from an attempt. So this is a video, I think it's like 1.5 minutes. And like we talked about at the beginning, this is clearly a police officer. In schools, would like to see our mental health staff doing suicide assessments. So none of this is me saying that the police officers who should be doing the suicide assessments in your building, but it's a nice quick video showing how he kind of goes through the questions. So we'll watch this quick, and then I'll address some of the things in the chat.
We received a 911 call from a woman named Joan who said she was upset and afraid she might kill herself. So I was dispatched to her location. I've been in situations like this before where it was really hard to tell if someone was actually in danger of suicide or not. Fortunately, I was recently introduced to CSSRS, and I could use a few quick questions to help me decide what level of care she needed. Hi, are you Joan?
Uh-huh.
I'm glad you called us. We're gonna get you some help, okay?
Okay.
I'm gonna ask you a few questions about your thoughts and behaviors over the past few weeks to help us better understand how to help you. Is that okay?
Okay. Am I gonna have to go to the hospital?
Let's just get all the information about what's going on first, and then we can talk about that, all right?
Okay.
Good. Have you wished you were dead, or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up?
Yeah. I wish I was dead right now.
Have you actually had any thoughts about killing yourself?
No, I would never do that.
Okay. Have you ever done anything? Started to do anything or prepared to do anything to end your life?
I mean, once when I was a teenager, I wrote a note to my friend saying I wanted to die, but nothing recently.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I want to just look at the chat here. Aaron's asking, I'm curious to why the intent is so important since the action can be deadly. I think intent is important because it helps us at an earlier stage identify when there has been an attempt. So many of the examples that were there, right? In the example I gave about the starvation, on itself, you wouldn't necessarily see that as suicidal behavior because it isn't so dangerous, right? The action that they're taking wouldn't necessarily even cause them physical harm, or the physical harm is slight, but the intent is there, which puts them more at likely for a future attempt. So I think that's the reason intent is so important, is that it helps us catch those early or first maybe attempts that indicate that they are at a high risk of suicide, that we maybe would have ignored without paying attention to that. Cecilia was wondering about the scenario where the person changed their mind and no longer wants to die. Does that change the situation from being a suicide attempt? No, right? It still is that warning flag of like, okay, they did engage in action that with the intent to die. It still puts them more at risk for future attempts. I often have students who answer to number 4. Yes, I have these thoughts, but I'm not sure if I will act on them. Struggle how to rate that answer. I think I would maybe ask for like exceptions. I think I would ask like, is there a situation or a time where you think you would act on them? So thinking about trying to get them to explain like, what would be the deciding factor? If this happened, would you, or when do they think they might act on them, and trying to get some more information from them. Okay, so this next slide is just something that I have came across that I think can sometimes be confusing, especially maybe as your buildings are hopefully developing or have a process around threat assessment. So with the increase of violence in schools, I think it's important that schools have a process for identifying when there are individuals who are on a pathway to targeted violence. And so individuals that there's a risk of harm, but it's not focused on themselves, it's focused on another person. And this is when it's a targeted threat and rather than a reactive behavior. So this is not a training about threat assessment, which is maybe something that we also should do. But this is the individual who, when there might be a situation where they tell a teacher that they're going to kill themselves, or you find a note that's a hit list, or you have some of those types of behavior. It's not suicidal, it's not thinking about themselves, but it's thinking about targeted violence towards somebody else. That is a different assessment process than suicide. And sometimes we need to do both, right? Sometimes there's a need for a suicide assessment and a threat assessment. I found when we in our district started to talk about threat assessment a lot, we were ending up doing threat assessments on kids who had expressed some suicidality, because they said, oh, well, they're threatening to hurt somebody themselves. It's like, no, these are two different types of assessments. So suicide is the risk of the harm is focused on themselves. Threat is when with the risk of the harm is focused on another person. I think schools need a process for both. You need a threat assessment process and you need a suicide assessment process. In some situations, you'll have kids who there's a risk of harm in both, and you need to do both assessments, but they're different assessments. Okay. Okay, just went to a training by Patrick Densley, and his perspective was that active shooters should be viewed as individuals who are suicidal. And I don't disagree with that. I think that doing a suicide assessment, I mean, if you're to the point where you have an active shooter, I mean, you're not going to be doing a suicide assessment on an active shooter, right? At that moment, it's about safety for everyone in your building. But if you have somebody that is on the threat to targeted violence, on that pathway that is showing some of those early warning signs, I think thinking about also doing a suicide assessment is important. Where I saw people get it wrong is when people were suicidal and then instead they were doing a threat assessment process. So I don't think it goes the other way. I don't think it's that everybody who's suicidal, we need to assess for threat. I could get behind that everybody who comes to our attention for a threat assessment, we should also be talking about a suicidal assessment. This is another again, just flow chart that sometimes the student, when they indicate harm, it isn't completely clear. And so is the harm threatened towards other? We want to think then about whether it's reactive or targeted. So I don't want to go too far into this, but reactive is often when we maybe have students that have an identified disability. We know they struggle with emotional regulation in kind of a reactive kind of way. They may make some threats, but don't necessarily seem to be on the threat of targeted violence. We're about providing support. If we're not sure, or we think they are on this pathway to violence, it would be considered a targeted threat, and we would refer it to the building threat assessment team. If the harm's directed towards self, right, that's when we would screen for risk using the Columbia, and then depending on what that risk assessment is, respond accordingly. I agree that often students are on both sides of this. So a couple considerations as we go through this is about letting your administrator know. I think that sometimes people have felt like, well, that's confidential information. I think there is a place where you can keep information confidential and let your administrator know. I met with the student. I followed up with the family. We are concerned about some suicidal risk. You don't need to know you don't need to go into all of the details, but just giving the administrator the heads up, I think is helpful in case something comes across their plate. Asking for a welfare check is another thing that you can do. Say this is done by the police, you can call their general number or talk with your school resource officer if you have one. Just if you can't get a hold of a client or a student, if you can't, it's a long weekend or they didn't show up for school, they are always willing, I have found, to run by a home and just check in on somebody if you are worried about that. Differentiated response. This is the idea that we need to differentiate our response based on our assessment results. If your response is everybody who mentions anything about wanting to die goes to the emergency department, we are likely, or sometimes, teaching our kids not to talk about suicidal ideation. And I learned this from a 5th grade student that I was working with. They had told one of their classroom staff that they wanted to die. And we did a suicide assessment, and I don't know if we really did. We talked with them about their suicidality. He reported wanting to die. And we had called the family, and the family took him into the emergency department. He sat in the emergency department for 6 hours with his mom. His mom had to miss work. And then they talked to the resident at the emergency department and were let go within 15 minutes. And he came back to school mad because his mom was mad because she had to miss work. And he told us directly, he's like, I am never going to tell you again when I'm thinking about wanting to die. And it was really learning for me that we need to make sure that when we are sending kids to the emergency department, that it is, sometimes I think we want to do it just to be sure, right? But I think we have to trust our own skill as providers and being able to assess that and create a plan that's appropriate for the level of suicidality risk that the student is exhibiting. And so having kind of a blanket response of everybody goes to the emergency department, I think can sometimes harm kids. And I think unintentionally can send the message that, don't really tell us about this, because it's kind of like getting sent to the principal's office or getting sent away, instead of creating that dialogue and opening up. Not to say you should never send anybody to the emergency department, right? But we need to have a differentiated response based on our own assessment. And I think the Columbia rating scale can help us with that. Storage of documents. This is one of the sticky situations we're going to talk about in a minute too. I personally feel uncomfortable putting this information in a student's CUME file. And I know that anything that was kept longer than the school year becomes part of the student's permanent record, according to FERPA. And I also know that a lot of you are under your own licensure rules about how you keep records. And so sometimes there can be some conflicting information about confidentiality and FERPA in your own licensing guidelines. And so I have chosen where I have kind of landed on this is that while FERPA requires anything that's kept longer than a year to be part of a student's record, it doesn't say that it has to be stored in the CUME file. That is how, as districts, we interpret that, but we can store things separately and still have it be part of a student's record, but it doesn't have to be in the CUME file for anybody who's accessing that file to see. And so storing those records separately but long-term is the way that I have kind of worked through and feel comfortable moving forward. I think it's something that I think it's tricky in a lot of ways. And it's something that are conversations that you have to have at your district in order, how do we meet all of these different requirements that are sometimes conflicting. Family notification, I think that you always want to engage families. You want to have the student's permission to engage the family, but if safety is a concern, this is one of those things where we may have to reach out to families if we believe there is a concern in the home, even if the student is concerned about that. So working through those situations, I think that sometimes where it gets a little bit tricky on this one is when you're checking in with the student every 2 weeks, and do you have to call every time that you're doing that? And I would say no, if you have that agreement with the family. I think at that first conversation, saying, I assessed your student, we used this scale, they came up in the low risk area. I want to continue to follow up with them. So I'm going to keep checking in on this with him. And if I become more concerned, if we see a change in that rating, I'm going to reach back out, but just want to let you know, I'm going to continue having this conversation because we want to keep an eye on this. And so then it would allow you that when there's a change in kind of that baseline to be able to follow up, but you don't necessarily need to be following up every time. Okay, so a couple of sticky situations here. What if a student makes suicidal statements every day? Do we do the Columbia every day? this is where you get really good at pulling out those questions, right? So again, I think I would want to be checking in, right? We're looking for things to change. So asking some of those questions, does that mean you need to bring the form in and they need to come in your office and you need to do the whole thing? I don't think so. I mean, like, you have to make this call. I'm not, you, based on the totality of the circumstances, but I think just being able to maybe give the person that's working with that student like some couple of like key questions, and if we get a different answer, then I want to pull them in. What if my admin or SRO reports that they already assessed the student for suicidality? I get a little hot on this topic. If you are an admin or an SRO, I really think this is a valuable role that our mental health providers play in school. This is why we're there. And so if this happened to me, I would likely say, oh, well, thank you for having that conversation with them. You know, based on my expertise and skills, I just want to follow up and make sure that there was nothing missed. And I want to use this screener tool and be able to have that for my records. So, because I'll want to check in with the student ongoing. Assessing for suicidal risk isn't a one-time event. We want to make sure that we're supporting the students ongoing. So I would do another follow-up with that student. What if the students say they don't want anyone to know? I think this is probably a situation that you have ran into many times. I think when we believe a student's safety is at risk, we want to let them know that we're going to do whatever we need to do in order to keep them safe. And give them maybe some options. Would you like me to call your family, or would you like us to do that together? So just thinking about how do we give students voice and choice in those decisions, and what way would they feel most comfortable about. But if we're really concerned and we think that they're indicating some, especially at the moderate or high level of risk, that we do need to follow up with the families. And so here's a couple of options of how we could do that. What if a student has a school-based mental health therapist on site, or what if they have a therapist in the community? If there's another mental health provider that's working with the student and I am a school-based provider, hopefully we have a release of information, and I think it's important to be sharing that information with the provider. I think working as a team with the therapist will help provide safety for the student. I think sometimes I've seen this, especially when there's a school-based therapist that's on site. I don't know how many of you have those in your schools. There is sometimes a question about like who assesses. And I think I don't think there's like a right answer. I think it's whoever is available and can meet with that student. So, you know, I think timeliness is often important. And so if the therapist is available, or if you have a chance to do it together, we want to just make sure that there's communication and that the student knows that we're a team here to support you. Nobody's in trouble because you're having these thoughts, but how do we work together to be able to address this? So I have a couple of comments that I think are private messages in the chat, but I'm curious if there are other sticky situations that you have ran into. We are at 9:02 too, so I'm going to stay on. I understand if you need to leave, but I will be here and I'm going to read through a couple of these chats. If you are looking for a speaker, if you think this would be as helpful training for your staff, or if you are looking for a training on trauma-informed practices or anything in your school, I know right now is a big time planning back to school week. Myself is available, and we have a team of people that are available that would love to talk to you about what those options are. I am going to put a couple of things in the chat here. This is the speaker guide if you want to look about what are some of the trainings that I provide. And then I'm also going to put the certificate there, is that second link that's from the Google Drive link. So that is the certificate for the training today. I will also send that out in email along with the recording. So thank you all for being here, and I'm going to stay on for a little bit and appreciate all of your time. Thank you for the work you do. So one question that's in the chat here is about going back to the differentiated response. And how do we rebuild trust, or how do we, when we have made the decision to send a student to the ED and they weren't admitted, or whatever happened, it wasn't a positive experience for them, or did they feel that that would help? I think the strategies that I would use are similar to what I use in any situation, right? Like, I think sometimes it's admitting as adults that maybe sometimes we get things wrong. So either I got it wrong in my assessment, or maybe the adults at the ED didn't take them seriously in the way that I thought they should. But I'm here and I listen to you. And I think just being able to be a little bit vulnerable and apologize that that happened, right? Like, I think it can be, if you're hurting and you share that with somebody and then you go to the hospital and they say, oh, it's not good enough, or you're not hurting enough. You know, it's almost like you're rejected, that your pain is rejected. Like, oh, that hurts. So really, like, just exploring some of those emotions and being vulnerable that maybe you're upset that they didn't take them seriously at the ED. And then maybe making some agreements about how you might handle information in the future. You know, like this, this is the point where I feel like I would have to call your family, and we might have to go through this again, but I still want us to keep open the conversation. So if you say that we talk about these thoughts, I'm not automatically going to send you to the ED unless I feel like the risk has increased, and being able to make some agreements with that. The other question. Okay, other question about like thinking about the example of it not being a suicide attempt, when we have the student who cut her wrist in order to get attention, and it feels like it diminishes the severity of that, because it could cause serious physical kind of damage and health risks to that student. And so by saying it's not a suicide risk is somehow diminishing that. I can see that. And I think what we're trying to assess for, what we're looking for in this situation is really about suicidal risk. So I think there is still risk for that student, right? Like, this is, there is still some concerns around emotional regulation and how the student is choosing to solve the problems that definitely warrant attention, and really taking that seriously, because that is very concerning. I just think in terms of suicidality, we really want to look at intent, because I think the point is that we tend to label things suicidal without really knowing an individual's intent or asking the questions. And so I hear your point, and I don't mean to diminish it. I think it's just making sure that we have a good suicidal assessment, and that, but that's only one little piece that we're talking about, right? There's a lot of other pieces that we need to take care of in that situation to support that student. Let me see if there's any other questions. Okay, yeah, questions around threat assessment. I have found the threat assessment world a little bit hard. I would love to say, like, this is the resource that I go to, but I will say that the process that we've developed in our district is a little bit of a couple of different models. And so that's a great question, and might be something I think about doing a training on in the future. I don't know if I feel like it's completely my area of expertise, but I have done a lot of study in that, about pulling together a process. The Dewey Cornell model is one that comes to mind that I think is a good starting point. It's pretty law enforcement based, and you can kind of go either way on that depending on what but I think that's a good place to start if you're looking for some resources. Do I think an LSW or LGSW should have outside liability insurance? Part of me wants to say yes, right? Because that seems like the safe answer, but like, no, I don't actually think you do. I think if there was, your school district has a huge liability policy that covers you and your actions when you are acting within your role. And if there is a lawsuit, which there have been very, very, very few lawsuits suing social workers or suing school districts in around suicide assessment, or the school district's policy is going to cover you acting within your role. So I don't feel that it's necessary. If you have questions, I think talking to your whoever does your insurance, usually your business office, about what liability coverage that you have. I've had that conversation, and I have been assured through that any lawsuit that's going to come through would be covered. So I have not made the decision that I didn't need it. Still looking at the chat here. Not all threats are mass shooting threats. Absolutely. So, just thinking about our threat assessment processes that we've done, I don't think any of them have been mass shooting events. A lot of them are targeted towards a certain individual within the school, more like kind of like stalking types of behaviors, or yeah, so I totally agree. I know mass shooting events kind of get the headlines, and I think it is maybe the driver for why we have a threat assessment process. But I think likely when you get into actually doing your assessments, most of them will not be kind of mass shooting events. We also know that, I mentioned this term a couple of times, this pathway to targeted violence, that in retrospect, if we look at a lot of the mass shooting incidents, there is some earlier behaviors or incidents that show that it's more of a pathway. And that is one thing that I've learned in my research and study and trainings, is looking for that pathway of targeted violence, and how can we intercede at an earlier point and change that pathway so they don't end up in these mass shooting events, so they don't end up in some of these things. But absolutely, there's all sorts of different events on that pathway. Do you think LSWs are working within their scope of practice by using this tool? I would say based on the tool, they would say absolutely yes. You're not diagnosing. You are you're assessing for suicide, and the tool itself would say that absolutely is acting within it's an appropriate tool for an LSW to be using. Why I get a little bit unsure of that is because it also would say that an SRO or your principal or your teacher or anybody could also be using it, which I would really like somebody who has some more of a mental health background to be part of that conversation, because I think the follow-up is so important. And I think the individuals that are going to be doing the follow-up and providing the support, it's not just about the assessment in the one moment in time, it's about how do we support that student. And that's why I think it's just really important that a member of that team is the one doing the assessment. Yeah, I agree, Alicia. There is kind of a level of judgment involved, but yeah, I think the tool would say that it's allowed. I think if you're not sure, or always bringing somebody else in, or consulting on that. I have So a question about, are there factors that need to be taken more seriously with intent and behavior? This is the screening version of the Columbia tool. So yes, I think if somebody's at that moderate risk, or, like maybe at any of the risk categories, maybe we do want to refer them on for a further assessment that would take into account some more of those factors and really get into more of that clinical piece and be looking at a diagnosis. This is a screener, right? This is kind of like wave the red flag over here. Okay, we got something to be worried about. So yes, I think that would be involved in a more thorough assessment. The screener, I think, is appropriate for most situations, but it's not the stop, right? I think that we want to think about how do we get them support, and we didn't really talk about that today. But whether that's a referral, whether that's ongoing support from a provider in your school, but I think that would be more of that conversation that you would need to have, and to be able to, if they're especially at that moderate or high risk, being able to have a more in-depth assessment around those different factors. Okay, do you find that intervention assessments are universal when working with youth of color in urban districts? I don't know if I can say all interventions and assessments, but I think the Columbia tool provides the skeleton of a conversation that can be adapted to the culture it can be culturally responsive to those that you're working with, right? You might not read the question in exactly the same way, but I think as long as you're getting to the answer to that question, and I know I mentioned this too, is after you have more experience with this tool, being able to incorporate those questions into a conversation. It's pretty awkward for anybody to pull out your piece of paper and be doing checks in front of the kids. If that's what you need to do at the onset of using this tool, but over time and getting more comfortable with these questions, being able to bring these things into a conversation. I mean, the tool has been validated across 103 languages. It's definitely been used in urban communities. But I would just think about being able to be culturally responsive in the use of those questions. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Appreciate you all being here, and I think we'll wrap up. Thank you.